David scoffed. Don't try to label this as love, Amanda. Love doesn't look like this. His words hung in the air as Amanda stood abruptly, frustration burning in her eyes. Fine, she snapped. I made a mistake. A huge, unforgivable mistake. But you've been so distant, Nick. You work late, barely talk to me anymore. I felt invisible. Her words hit like a punch. A part of him wanted to counter, to insist that her feelings didn't justify what she'd done. But another part, one he hated to acknowledge, wondered if there was truth in what she said. That doesn't make what you did okay, he replied after a long pause, his tone quieter now. Amanda's gaze softened as her defiance began to crumble. Tears filled her eyes and she angrily wiped them away. I don't know what else to say, she murmured. I know I've destroyed everything, but I don't want to lose you, Nick. Her words were heavy with desperation, lingering in the silence. Nick exhaled deeply, the weight of his decision pressing on him. You already lost me, Amanda, he said at last, his voice steady. The moment you chose him over us, you made your decision. Now, I'm making mine. Her shoulders sagged as tears streamed down her face. She opened her mouth as if to say more, but Nick held up a hand. Take your things and go. If we talk again, it'll be through a lawyer. This time, Amanda didn't argue. She grabbed the suitcase, her hands trembling as she wheeled it to the door. She paused for a moment, glancing back at him. Goodbye, Nick, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nick didn't respond, standing silently as she left the house for the last time. The door closed softly, and the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, though, it felt like the start of something new. The sound of the door clicking shut reverberated in the stillness, final and unyielding. It felt like the end of a chapter, sealing the story of their life together. Nick stood there, staring at the space Amanda had just occupied, the weight of the past few days pressing on him like a leaden blanket. He should have felt relief. He had taken control, set boundaries, and removed her from his life. But all he felt was a hollow emptiness. Later that evening, Tyler let himself in with the spare key. He found Nick sitting in the living room, a half-empty glass of whiskey on the table in front of him. You all right? Tyler asked, dropping into the chair across from him. Nick shook his head, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid. Not really. Tyler leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, I won't sugarcoat it. What she did was awful. But you handled it better than most would have. You didn't let her walk all over you. It doesn't feel that way, Nick muttered. It feels like she still won, like she took everything I thought I knew about my life and tore it apart. Tyler nodded slowly. I get that. But she didn't win, Nick. She doesn't get to keep pretending, to keep lying. You exposed her for who she is. That's not a win for her. It's a reckoning. Nick let the words sink in, the harsh truth mingling with the ache in his chest. He wanted to believe Tyler, to find some victory in the ruins of his life. But it wasn't that simple. She said she didn't want to lose me, Nick said after a long silence. She cried. I've seen her cry before, but this time felt different. Tyler raised an eyebrow. Do you think she meant it? I don't know, Nick admitted. Maybe, but it doesn't matter. Even if she regrets it, it doesn't erase what she did. It doesn't undo the lies or the betrayal. Exactly, Tyler said firmly. Don't let her draw you back in with crocodile tears. People like that always find a way to justify their actions. Don't give her the chance. Nick nodded but couldn't shake the nagging doubt lingering in his mind. Had he done enough? Had he missed something deeper that explained why she had done this? As the hours dragged on, Nick scrolled through his phone, revisiting the photos, messages, and the timeline of her deceit. Every piece of evidence felt like a fresh wound, but he couldn't stop. He needed to understand. Then, while combing through her emails one last time, he noticed something he'd previously overlooked. A forwarded message from Greg, buried among her work emails. The subject line read, "About your husband." Nick's blood ran cold. Opening the email, his heart pounded as he read the brief message. Emily, I can't do this anymore. I found out about Nick. I can't be part of this, and I don't know how you can live with yourself. You need to figure out what you really want because this isn't fair to him or me. The email was dated a week before Nick had confronted them at the hotel. The realization hit him hard. Greg had known. Maybe not from the start, but he had eventually figured it out. And despite that, he had chosen to stay and meet her again. Nick dropped his phone onto the table, his hands trembling. This wasn't just about Amanda anymore. Greg wasn't some innocent victim caught in her web of lies. He was complicit, a willing participant in her betrayal. Tyler noticed Nick's reaction and leaned forward. "What is it?" Nick pushed the phone toward him. "Read it," he said, his voice tight. Tyler scanned the email, his expression darkening. Unbelievable. He knew, and he still met her? "Exactly," Nick said bitterly. "He's just as guilty as she is." Tyler sat back, exhaling sharply. "So what now? Are you going to confront him?" Nick stared at the phone, his mind racing. "Not yet," he said slowly. "But if he thinks he's off the hook, he's got another thing coming." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Nick felt something besides anger or despair. He felt resolve. The more he thought about it, the more the email gnawed at him. Greg wasn't just someone tangled in Amanda's lies. He had known the truth about Nick and chosen to stay. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Seeing you reconnect with someone from your past isn't about jealousy," he began, his voice calm but tinged with unease. "It's just strange. Really strange." While his tone wasn't harsh, it carried a genuine discomfort he couldn't suppress. He didn't want to linger on the topic, but something deep inside him felt unsettled. The soothing sounds of the beach, waves lapping at the shore, and bursts of carefree laughter did little to ease his growing tension. He glanced over at Amanda, who lay sprawled under the sun, as if nothing had happened. Despite her apparent ease, David felt a restlessness gnawing at him that he couldn't explain. The encounter at the beach stuck with him for days. No matter how much he tried to push the images away, memories of Amanda and Josh laughing and exchanging glances intruded on his thoughts. It was more than just discomfort. It went beyond the awkwardness of the setting. There was something between them, an unspoken connection that hung in the air like an invisible thread. Whether Amanda ignored it or simply chose not to acknowledge it, David felt its presence keenly. That night, as Amanda slept peacefully beside him, David lay awake staring at the ceiling. He wrestled with his thoughts, trying to rationalize the unease. "Maybe it's just paranoia," he whispered into the dark room, as though trying to convince himself. But every time he shut his eyes, he saw the way Amanda had hugged Josh, the tone of their interaction steeped in familiarity and intimacy. It haunted him. In the days that followed, Amanda acted as if nothing had changed. She smiled more often, her mood lighter, almost carefree. To David, her cheerful demeanor should have been comforting, but instead it only deepened his suspicions. Her happiness felt misplaced, even dissonant. He noticed the little things. Her phone, which she once left on the table or couch, now seemed permanently attached to her. She chuckled softly at messages, a sound he rarely heard. "It's just work," she would say, but David couldn't recall her job ever eliciting laughter before. The tension grew until one evening, while Amanda was in the shower, David saw his opportunity. Sitting on the couch, he noticed her phone resting on the table. His heart began to race as if he were about to commit a crime. He knew it was wrong to invade her privacy, but his doubts had grown into a consuming need for answers. For several minutes, he wrestled with himself, but curiosity and the demand for clarity won. With trembling fingers, he picked up the phone. The screen was locked, but David knew the code. Amanda had never hidden it. Exhaling heavily, he entered the digits, unlocking the device. He scanned the notifications, his pulse quickening as nothing seemed out of place. But when he opened the messaging app, his breath caught. Josh's name was at the very top. David froze, debating for a moment before tapping the conversation. He expected harmless chatter, something that would put his mind at ease and make him regret his suspicions. What he found, however, was the opposite. The messages were far from innocent. There were jokes, compliments, and references to moments David wasn't a part of. Several messages alluded to their day at the beach, but in a way that excluded him entirely. One message in particular made his stomach churn. "It was great seeing you again. Just like old times. We should do it again soon." He read and reread the words, desperate to find a different meaning. But the context was unmistakable. Josh wasn't just an old acquaintance. He still held a significant place in Amanda's life, a place that seemed to be growing. David heard the water stop and panicked. He quickly put the phone back where he'd found it, trying to mask the storm raging in his mind. He knew he couldn't confront her yet. He needed time to process what he had seen. From that moment on, everything about Amanda began to feel different. What had once been admiration and trust transformed into a mix of sadness and suspicion. David didn't know what his next step would be, but one thing was certain. He could no longer ignore the situation. The following days were emotionally exhausting for David. Every interaction with Amanda became an internal battle. He wanted to lash out, to confront her with the messages and demand answers, but he restrained himself. A part of him still clung to the hope of understanding how they had reached to this point. Sitting at the breakfast table one morning, David watched Amanda as she casually discussed weekend plans. Her ease only deepened his sense of alienation. He felt like a stranger in his own home. "You're quiet," Amanda said, glancing up from her coffee. "Is everything okay?" David forced a smile. "Just thinking about work," he lied, though work was the furthest thing from his mind. Amanda accepted his response without question and turned her attention back to her phone. She laughed softly at something on the screen, and David felt a pang of certainty that it was from Josh. That night, while Amanda got ready for bed, David remained in the living room, staring blankly at the dark television screen. The faint reflection of the room's lights flickered on the surface. Hearing her footsteps approach, he took a deep breath. "Amanda, can we talk?" he asked, his voice firm enough to stop her mid-step. She paused, curious but not alarmed. "Sure, what's wrong?" she asked, settling on the arm of the couch. David turned to face her, his heart pounding. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." "Can you do that?" Amanda tilted her head, intrigued but wary. "You're scaring me. What's going on?" David held her gaze, searching for a sign of sincerity. "I saw some things, messages between you and Josh. I didn't want to invade your privacy, but I felt like something was off and I needed to know." "So, Amanda, what's going on between you two?" Her expression faltered, her face paling as the smile faded from her lips. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, her silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, she took a deep breath. "David, I didn't want you to find out this way. We've just been talking. He's an old friend, and I was happy to see him again. That's all." David's frustration surged. "Nothing going on, Amanda?" Those messages didn't seem like two old friends catching up. "I read what he wrote and how you replied. It feels like more than that." Amanda avoided his gaze, but David leaned forward, his voice firm. "Look at me. Tell me the truth. I need to know." At last, she met his eyes. Guilt and hesitation etched into her expression. "Okay," she began, her voice shaky. "I got carried away. It wasn't physical, I swear. But I started talking to him more than I should have." David felt as though a heavy weight had dropped onto him. "The wrong time?" he repeated, his voice edged with disbelief. "Amanda, we're married. We promised to be honest with each other. If you felt disconnected, why didn't you come to me? Why turn to him?" Amanda lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper at first. "I don't know, David. I don't know. It was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt you, and I still love you." He wanted to believe her. He desperately wanted to think they could fix this. But the messages, the laughter, and her decision to keep it all hidden spoke louder than any words of regret. "It's not just about loving me, Amanda. It's about trust. And now, I don't know if I can trust you anymore." The room fell silent, the air heavy with everything left unsaid. Amanda looked close to tears, but David felt no anger, only a deep and hollow sadness. He knew this conversation was just the beginning of something far more painful, something he wasn't sure he was prepared to confront. That night, after their talk, David stayed awake while Amanda slept beside him. The house felt vast and empty, as though their words had created an emotional chasm between them. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, he stared blankly into the distance. Amanda's words echoed in his mind. "I still love you. It was a mistake." But could love alone make up for what felt like a profound betrayal? Could they rebuild on a foundation that now seemed so fragile? The following morning, Amanda tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. She made breakfast and casually asked if David needed anything for work. His responses were mechanical, his gaze avoiding hers. The tension in the air was palpable, as though one wrong word could set off an explosion. David knew they couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. That evening, after a long day at work where he could barely focus, David came home with a clear intention. He needed to have one final, honest conversation with Amanda. He found her sitting in the living room, her phone in hand, her expression unreadable. When he entered, she noticed the serious look on his face and quickly put her phone down. "Amanda, can we talk again?" David's voice was calm, but carried enough weight to make her sit up straight. She nodded, appearing ready, though far from at ease. David sat across from her in an armchair, deliberately maintaining a distance he'd never felt compelled to before. "I spent the day thinking about everything you said last night, about what happened and about us." He paused, watching her closely. Amanda stayed quiet, nodding slightly to show she was listening. "You called it a mistake," he continued. "But Amanda, you arranged all of this. You knew Josh would be at that beach. This wasn't something that just happened. You sought it out." His words cut through the quiet, and David saw their effect on Amanda's face. She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I need to understand why. Why did you think this was something you could do without considering what it would mean for us? For me?" Amanda took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "David, I made a terrible mistake, but I didn't plan it to hurt you. I was confused. When Josh showed up, it felt like an escape. Something easy, something that reminded me of who I was before all this." "Before us," David repeated, each word hitting him like a blow. "We're not a burden, Amanda. Or at least I never thought we were. But now you're telling me I made you feel that way?" She shook her head quickly. "No, it's not about you. It's about me. I think I've lost parts of myself over the years. And when Josh showed up, it felt like a chance to reconnect with that person. But I know that's no excuse. I was selfish." David sat in silence for a long moment, letting her words sink in. He wanted to yell, to tell her she had no right to seek connection elsewhere when he had always been there, ready to do whatever it took for them. But instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. He no longer had the energy to fight for something Amanda had seemingly let go of long ago. "I understand that you're confused," he said finally, his voice heavy. "But I'm confused too. And right now, I don't know if I can keep trying to fix something you broke." Tears welled in Amanda's eyes, but before she could respond, David stood. He walked to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and began packing clothes. Amanda followed him, lingering in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," he replied, not pausing in his packing. "I need space. I need to think. And I think you do too." When he zipped the suitcase and walked past her, Amanda reached out to grab his arm, but he gently pulled away. "David, please don't leave like this." He stopped and looked at her for a long moment. She could see the pain and fatigue in his eyes as he spoke. "Amanda, I loved you with everything I had. But sometimes, love just isn't enough." With those words, he left, leaving Amanda standing in a house that suddenly felt far too big. David drove aimlessly through the city, his suitcase tossed in the back seat. The night outside was eerily calm, mocking him with its stillness as the storm inside him raged on. Eventually, he stopped at a modest roadside motel, a quiet place where no questions were asked. In the small, unassuming room, David sat on the edge of the bed and finally let the weight of the last 48 hours crash down on him. He was out of the house, away from the woman he still loved, but who had shattered his trust nearly beyond repair. As the days passed, David began to confront questions he had been avoiding. Amanda's betrayal had consumed him, but it also forced him to ask, who am I without her? For years, he had poured himself so completely into their marriage that he had neglected parts of himself, his interests, his passions, the things that once made him who he was. He thought about the days when he loved hiking, playing guitar, or sketching. Over time, those pieces of his identity had been swallowed by routine and complacency. One afternoon, while walking through a park near the motel, David came across a group of young people playing music outdoors. They laughed and sang, their voices off-key but full of life. He stopped to watch, drawn to their energy. Noticing him, one of them smiled and called out, "Hey, want to give it a try?" Without overthinking, David accepted. They handed him a guitar, and though his fingers were rusty, they remembered how to move across the strings. He played a simple tune, but to him, it felt like reclaiming a lost part of himself. When he finished, the group clapped. but the applause that mattered most came from within. For the first time in months, David felt like he was reconnecting with who he was. Meanwhile, Amanda was facing her own reckoning. The home that once felt alive now echoed with emptiness, a reflection of the choices she had made. She spent her days revisiting the moments when she had felt herself drifting from David but had chosen to ignore it. She reread the old messages with Josh, now deleted, feeling nothing but regret. What once seemed exciting now stood as a reminder of her failure to confront her own fears and insecurities. One night, Amanda opened an old box from the closet. Inside were letters, photos, and notes she and David had exchanged in the early days of their relationship. Reading their hopeful, loving words, she cried, realizing how much she had lost and how much she might never get back. Yet amidst her sorrow, a new determination emerged. She couldn't undo the past, but she could take responsibility for the present. Amanda decided she needed to speak to David, not to beg for forgiveness, but to own up to her mistakes and show him that she was committed to becoming a better person, no matter what he chose. A few weeks later, David returned to the city to pick up some documents needed for the divorce. He let Amanda know he'd be stopping by, but made it clear he didn't want a long conversation. When he arrived, he found her in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea as if it were keeping her grounded. She looked nervous, but there was something different in her demeanor. David grabbed the papers and was about to leave when Amanda spoke. "David, please, give me 5 minutes. Not to change your mind, just so I can say what I need to say." After a brief hesitation, David leaned against the doorframe and nodded. "Go ahead." Amanda took a deep breath. "I made terrible mistakes," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "I lied. I betrayed you. But these past weeks have shown me this isn't just about us. It's about me. I was running from my own problems, and I hurt the one person who always stood by me." David listened silently, his expression unreadable. "I don't expect forgiveness," Amanda continued, tears glistening in her eyes. "And I'm not sure I deserve it. But I wanted you to know I'm working on myself. Not for you, but for me. Because I want to be better." When she finished, silence filled the room. After a long pause, David finally spoke.